Essentially, this is what must be developed. The art of giving out in love and intelligence what is taken in from vision and the experience of self-transcendence and solidarity with the universe. Das ist es im Wesentlichen, was wir weiterentwickeln müssen. Die Kunst, mit Liebe und Intelligenz das weiterzugeben, was wir in der Vision und in der Erfahrung der Selbsttranszendierung und des Einsseins mit dem Universum aufgenommen haben.
Well, this is my first opportunity to welcome everyone to Palenque, and so though I've met some of you and talked with some of you, there are many of you I haven't yet had any connection with. Welcome to Palenque. This is one of my favorite places in the world. I've come here now about 9 times in the last 16 years by fate and coincidence, and I'm not big on past lives or that sort of thing, but there must be something in my faith that keeps returning me to this incredibly verdant, beautiful place. It's at exactly the same latitude that I live at in Hawaii, so it's the same stars over my front porch as I see every night over the cabana. The talk tonight, I see, goes under the banner Linear Societies and Nonlinear Drugs. It could have been titled Psychedelics as Tools of Philosophical Investigation. Basically, my relationship to psychedelic plants and experiences, and why I'm talking tonight and you're listening, I suppose, is because for 30 years or more, I've been fascinated by the psychedelic experience. And I had a fairly narrow notion of what that was. And I've been called focused, and I've been called biased, and I've been called things I won't repeat here. But what I was interested in was visual hallucination, because it seemed to me, measured against values which I suppose are innate in my cultural upbringing, that when I was visually hallucinating, that was the clearest indication to me that I was in the presence of the miraculous. Racing thoughts, insights, changes of position and mind and attitude. I've experienced all of those things outside the presence of psychedelic substances and plants. But intense three-dimensional visual hallucination has always fascinated me, and does to this day, as new technologies facilitate 3D animation and thinking about objects in this very detailed and in-depth and colorful way that was previously familiar to me only from hallucinations. So from my peculiar perspective, culture has moved in the direction of a psychedelic agenda by moving toward ever more immediate and involving and high-dimension modes of conveying information. For me, that is the essence of the psychedelic experience. And someone at dinner recently was saying, well, what about the emotional and therapeutic and that part of it? Well, I certainly have benefited from that aspect of it, but I think if you take psychedelics regularly and with attention, you work through the personal stuff at some point. and you move on to the transpersonal, the big picture stuff. And it's that kind of big picture stuff that I sort of want to talk about tonight in a kind of chaotic and haphazard way, and then we can talk about it afterwards, which is, to my mind, the most interesting part. Ken always forces us to formalize or formulate these talks months in advance so that he can print it in the brochures so that you can know what you're getting into. So there always comes a place in August or September where he calls me up and I have 24-hour notice to dream up the names of 2 talks which will be given 6 months hence by the side of the pool in Palenque. And so I pulled this nonlinear drugs, linear societies thing out of a hat. It's because I wanted to make the connection between, or the link, between the concept of drugs and substances and states of intoxication as forms of cultural vestiture, you could say. In other words, something which we put on, something which we take on, and the effects of media, and especially print, because I'm a thoroughgoing McLuhanist on one level. I think one of the great unassimilated insights of 20th century discourse was McLuhan's whole understanding that how we convey information shapes our psychologies and shapes our cultural values and shapes the kinds of economic arrangements we make, the kinds of religious institutions that are tolerated, so forth and so on, and that Western civilization's accomplishments and horrifying myopia to its own destructiveness is all a product of the of print, of the shift in what McLuhan called sensory ratios that occurred when medieval manuscript using civilization went over to a form of media that allowed infinite repeatability, infinite uniformity, a democratizing of databases, and so forth and so on. And at first it was hard for me to make the McLuhanist leap, to believe that things as seemingly different and unrelated as the idea of the democratic citizen and the modern automobile assembly line were both systems that could only be permitted in a print-tolerant world where the ideas of uniformity, linearity, and repeatability had already become second nature. Well, it may be coincidence or it may be causally linked that our commitment to print or our romance with the cultural effects of print has been paralleled by our deepest alienation and ignorance from not only the psychedelic experience, but from the metaphor of the spirit, the invisible world, transformative possibilities of all sorts have gone from being the ruling metaphors of Western culture to a set of ideas scorned by intellectuals and looked down upon as atavistic relics of peasant thinking or something like that. The print constellated individual is a thoroughgoing empiricist, a thoroughgoing materialist, and is fixated on the surface. Appearance, what your eyes tell you is all there is a sort of unstated assumption of the print ad. Well, I think it's those kinds of values that have made the effort then to bring the psychedelic experience and the psychedelic technologies And I use that in the way that that word technology is in the way that Mircea used it when he called his huge study of shamanism, the archaic techniques of ecstasy. And in French, that word la technique has the connotation of technology more clearly than in English. We're talking about shamanic techniques and the difficulty of print culture to assimilate these, and the cultural war and impasse that this has created, under which we all operate, is one of the things that I want to talk about tonight, because I think the situation is changing, and changing in unexpected or unpredictable ways, unless you think in McLuhanesque or postmodern deconstructionist metaphors of some sort. In other words, it's not obvious. On the surface, the drug culture issue is couched in terms where safety is stressed and benefit is stressed. Psychedelics are good. They don't addict, they don't create mania, people grow under their influence. If we who knew this could but convince those who doubt this, then the laws would be changed and a new cultural order would be established, and we would be vindicated, and mankind would move forward. This is the cheerful story, or the cheerful faith, maybe, of those who haven't looked too deeply into it. I don't know whether you would classify my point of view as more pessimistic, or more optimistic, or more realistic. But I think what's being negotiated here are incredibly important die-hard issues, and no side can yield without abandoning its first principles, and that these two things are like oil and water, and that no matter how harmless or beneficial you show cannabis to be, and however many medical commissions or reports that are brought to the attention of the state, it will remain a very sensitive issue, because really what's at issue are the sensory ratios under which the culture will operate. Nothing less than what shall be real and what shall not be real. The evidence of the senses have always, until the 20th century, guided the evolution of natural science. But in the 20th century, scientific instruments pushed below the level of the evidence of the senses, and in some ironic parallel to the psychedelic experience, revealed a world as wacky, as contradictory, as surreal, and as peculiar as is revealed in a high-dose psilocybin or acid trip. The world of quanta, the world of tunneling energy barriers and time reversals and virtual fluctuations and particles springing from nothing, and so forth and so on. So what's happening here is that the program, if you want to put it that way, the philosophical program of linear print-created reductionism, prosecuted for 1,000 years, finally ran its intellectual machinery into an immovable object, or a number of immovable objects at the quantum level, and contradiction began to emerge. The most famous contradiction, which now looks transcendable, was Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which seemed to be this weird result out of the most mathematically defined branch of science, which was physics, which said, as you gain information on the position of a particle, you lose information on its velocity. Conversely, as you lose information on its velocity, you gain information on its position. But somehow, because of the nature of things, it was thought, you cannot know the position and the velocity at the same time. Instead, there is always this uncertainty factor. Well, probably no principle of physics in the 20th century had as much ink spilled about it by non-physicists as that one did. And the New Age took it to its breast and proclaimed this was a bridge between science and magic and so forth and so on. Well, but now, let's go beneath the surface and tell, as Paul Harvey says, the real story.
The rest of the story.
The rest of the story. Page 2. Yeah. It turns out that back in the 20s, when the quantum was being discovered and defined, there were 2 quantum theories available to the interested community of physicists. And they were mathematically, in terms of the results they kicked out, exactly identical. So the only criteria for choosing one over the other was aesthetic. In other words, which was the most elegant, as scientists like to say, or sometimes they say which is the most parsimonious, meaning which is the most, fits the most information into the smallest, and which is the least counterintuitive. This is a strong value when making aesthetic judgments in science. The counterintuitive is to be rejected. Well, both of these theories had aspects of them which were counterintuitive. The Heisenberg Bohr formulation had this thing I've just described to you embedded in it, the uncertainty principle, the weird counterintuitive notion that somehow you couldn't know position and velocity with absoluteness simultaneously. It's a messy idea. But it turns out the competitor theory had something embedded in it so counterintuitive, so bizarre, so absolutely against the grain of rational extrapolation, that it was the general judgment of the community of physicists that they should leave it alone. Well, what was this other theory? Well, it's associated with the name of David Bohm. And what was this unswallowable, counterintuitive assumption built into David Bohm's theory of the quanta? It was that there was some kind of non-local superspace in which the entire universe was embedded, and that this, if you want to think of it as a higher dimension or an energy field or something like that, but whatever this non-local thing was, it had properties that were very woo-woo. One of its properties was that it indicated that all things which had ever been connected remained connected. And since the faith of physics is that the entire universe sprang from an area smaller than the diameter of the nucleus of the atom in a single moment, and then spewed out, carrying space and time with it, that meant then that all those particles maintained this weird non-local connection in this Bohm superspace. And the other counterintuitive and completely peculiar thing about this superspace was that it was non-relativistic. So, for instance, if you affected a particle, its pair or its linked partner would undergo the inverse of whatever changes you affected upon it in order to conserve parity instantly, with zero time lag, no matter how much space separated these two entities. Well, so this seemed so peculiar that it was tossed out. And remained only professional physicists knew that this choice had ever been made and these issues breached. But it hovered in the background. It never quite died. This idea of a non-local superspace connecting all space and time instantaneously. And various so-called Gedankenexperimenten, as physicists say, meaning just simply thought experiments, were done through the 40s and the 50s thinking about this. Well, in the 70s, a guy named John Bell began working with this, and he actually built apparatus which tested for the presence of this non-local superspace. And what he would do is he would generate an electron pair, put them through some kind of a filter, magnetic field, send one way, one the other way. Then he would zero in on one. Then he would flip its magnetic moment while observing the other one. And his experiments, now accepted by the majority of the community of physicists, show that this Bell superspace, this non-local space that the Bohm quantum theory kicks out, is real. It's actually there. There is some kind of glue. There is some kind of very real and demonstrable connectivity between all points of space and time.
The magic of it is that the two particles are going each at the speed of light, therefore defying Einstein, and they forces therefore the non-local view.
Yes, the change occurs with zero time, no matter how far apart these particles are at the time the measurement is made.
What is the change that occurs?
Well, you can do different things, but usually what they do is they flip the magnetic polarity, and then you can see that the other one, to conserve what's called parity, which is a quality of these pairs of particles that must be conserved. So it's like they're connected by a hyperdimensional rubber band of some sort. Well, now, what does all this have to do with the psychedelic situation? Well, simply this. Years ago, Sasha wrote a paper, and I'm not sure that I remember the exact formulation of the title, but I believe it was Quantum Mechanical Correlates to Hallucinogenesis. What he was basically saying in this paper was, here you have a pentexyl group or a ring-structured a molecule of some sort, and by the conformational readjustment of one atom, it changes from an active to an inactive compound. Well, this is a perfect demonstration, to my mind, I mean, from a scientific point of view, of the quantum mechanical basis of consciousness. If one atom can make a white powder go from active to inactive, then consciousness is thereby shown to be a phenomenon rooted in the quantum mechanical realm. Well, where then do we ordinarily contact or see or feel this quantum mechanical domain? Well, I maintain it's in the act of thinking. That thinking is below the level of molecular chemistry. I find it very hard to believe that conformational changes by the tens of millions are taking place at the molecular level in the neural substrate as an accompaniment to the act of thinking. I mean, I'm not scientist enough to do the calculations, but it seems to me if that were true, your head should burst into flame from the amount of caloric energy being pulled into that process. It seems far more likely to me that thought is a quantum mechanical an electrochemical, quantum mechanical flux phenomenon involving charge transfers in these molecules without conformational change. In other words, we're not a diesel engine, we're a transistor radio, is sort of what I'm trying to say. Well, so then, and follow my argument here, if it's followable, that's our ordinary experience of the quantum mechanical world, that somehow biology has harnessed quantum mechanics for the purposes of thought. And before I move on to psychedelics, let me just mention 35 years ago, maybe that long ago, Albert St. George, the Nobel Prize laureate, wrote a little 70-page booklet called Toward a Submolecular Biology. And he talked in there about the charge transfer capacity of various aromatic compounds. Even DMT even occurs in a list of the more reactive of these electron-donating compounds. And he made the plea there. He said, we will not understand biology until we drop our gaze, our inspection below the molecular level and toward the submolecular. In other words, toward the quantum mechanical. Biology has not been responsive to this challenge. I mean, there's been some good work out at the University of Arizona and some other very speculative work, but largely the success of molecular genetics has halted biology's machinery of explanation at the gene level, and that is not going to tell us what the phenomenon of life really is. Well, that's just a digression, but let me follow this through here. So our ordinary experience of quantum mechanical domains is ordinary thinking and dreams, let's say. But then we perturb our consciousness with substances or with the byproducts of plant metabolism, alkaloids, indoles, tropanes. And extremely dramatic changes take place. And I'm only myself interested, many alterations of consciousness take place, but as I said at the beginning, what I'm interested in are these high-gain three-dimensional channels of information that open up and that we call visual hallucination. Because in order to not trivialize the phenomenon, which doesn't feel trivial at all, it feels like you're gazing into God's workshop. So in order to not trivialize the phenomenon and do a nothing but static in my neural circuitry, nothing but intoxication, nothing but the contents of my own personal or collective nothing but, I don't think it is nothing but. I think it's all and everything, to steal a phrase from people I don't usually visit. It's all and everything. It is the hyperdimensional modality, or it is the hologram of the universal vector of dynamic becoming. And it's very hard to English it, because English is not adapted to it. And it is made up of the sum total of all mental phenomena and their derivatives, such as artifacts, such as ruins, hieroglyphs, machines, buildings, fashions, and so on, of all forms of higher organization in the universe. In other words, it is beyond the particle accelerator, beyond the Hubble Space Telescope. It turns out that right behind your eyebrows is this instrument, which can be tuned to read information out of the entire cosmos. And we know, because we see back 12 billion years, that the universe is fractally organized, and that large-scale dynamics are iterated over larger and larger scales. And so I think that principle, which is even visually established for us in the fact that, just to be simple-minded here for a minute, an atomic system looks like a solar system, which looks like a spiral galaxy, which looks like a cluster of galaxies. Looking at that, how can one not understand that what it is saying is information is distributed this way as well? In other words, it's all nearby. You know, the alchemists used to say, as above, so below. And with the added adumbration, what is not here is nowhere. What is here is everywhere. And I think, you know, shaman, with whatever local languages and local metaphors were available to them, stumbled into this a long, long time ago, because they didn't have particle accelerators and the internet and all these things to distract them from the entertainment of the neocortex. And they were also much closer and more deeply entwined in the biological and botanical environment than we are. So that's one idea that I wanted to put across tonight. The idea that what is counterintuitive to a linear society becomes, when that linear society applies its own intellectual methodology fairly, it is controverted. In other words, the method of science has in a sense shown the limitation of science. You can go only so far with measurement and experiment. Eventually, the harder questions involve turning the light of inspection back on the inquiring mind itself. And at that point, the stakes rise. It becomes philosophically more challenging. The conclusions become less easy to make and to understand. I want to talk about another counterintuitive finding, and I want, without sounding too like I'm beating my own drum here, but it was helpful, I have to say. In line with the discovery of Bell's non-local space, in other words, sharing with its counterintuitivity and its improbability, an enormous intellectual breakthrough has taken place in the last 12 months since we were at Uxmal. It's probably as enormous a revolution in human thought as the revolution wrought by Newton or by Einstein. But it has just happened. It is, it has not yet been passed down through the mills of information redaction that hand the truths out to ourselves and to the public. And what I'm talking about is the discovery in the past 6 months, 7 months of what is called the cosmological constant. Cosmological constant omega. And let me background this a little bit for you. The universe until 6 months ago was assumed to be well understood at the energetic level and under the rule of 4 forces: the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. Now, I don't propose to teach a course in physics here tonight, so let's forget the strong and weak force. they both operate inside the confines of the nucleus of the atom, and you will never feel or confront them. They do hold the universe together and make it possible, but they don't act outside this very defined and small area. What acts upon our world, we thought, until 6 months ago, was of the electromagnetic force and gravity. And I think, without going into it, you're pretty familiar with what these are. I want to say a little bit about gravity, because gravity was assumed to be the big cosmos-shaping force. Gravity is subject to the universe square law, but nevertheless all parts of the universe feel the tug of the mass within the cosmos. And the assumption in cosmology until 6 months ago was that the universe would either, that its outward velocity would overcome the resistance of gravity, and the universe would expand forever, growing colder and more distant, its parts from each other, or that at a certain point gravity would overcome the outward expansive force of the universe, and the universe would begin to reverse its expansion, and the stars would begin to move together again, and that some billions of years out in the future, temperatures would rise, galactic structures would be dissipated by chaotic tidal forces, and everything would merge and smush together into a kind of backward replay of the Big Bang. And the puzzle and the business of cosmology until 6 months ago was to figure out whether the universe was open, i.e. would expand forever, or closed, i.e. would eventually undergo this catastrophic gravitational collapse. Well, about 7 months ago, a group of astronomers who had been studying a certain kind of supernova clusters and calculating the speed of the expansion of the universe reported a peculiar result. And this is using, theory and mathematics that has been well tested for over 40 years without breaking down. They reported results which seem to indicate that the universe was expanding faster than could be accounted for. When you brought all this data and theory together, you get a certain prediction. It turned out the prediction and the observed fact seem to be at significant variance. Well, so when this happens in basic physics, people prick up their ears because it's not supposed to fail at this point. So other teams jumped in, confident that they would quickly discover whatever assumption or artifact in the data had skewed these people and caused them to observe this weird result. Well, the second and the third and the fourth group looking at this and using somewhat different methods and assumptions all reported the same results. The universe is expanding faster, significantly faster than it should, given the known laws of physics. A force is operating on the entire universe that has been previously unobserved by science until last July. Well, what is the nature of this force? Well, when physicists get into a bind like this, they dig into their own history to see if anybody had thought of this and rejected it before. Well, it turns out when you go back into the history of 20th century physics, that Einstein, of all people, had worried about he felt that general relativity, he didn't like this idea of the universe collapsing back on itself. He felt that that was counterintuitive. And at one point in his theory making, he said, well, what if we just put in this fudge factor this thing which we'll call omega, the cosmological constant. And if we put it into the equations, then we'll overcome the resistance of gravity and the universe will expand forever. Well, he took more shit for this than for any hypothesis of his entire career. And after about 6 months of it being chewed on by the physics community, he withdrew it. This was in the 30s. And then later he said, my romance with the cosmological constant was the biggest blunder I ever made. Well, it turns out that there is a cosmological constant, that omega is real, but the consequences of tolerating this are as crazy, as counterintuitive, in some ways more startling than the consequences of tolerating Bohm's formulation of the quanta, which gives you this non-local Bell space of connectivity that puts everything together. Why? Well, here's why. Here's what you have to put up with if this cosmological constant omega is real. It means that the universe is going to expand forever. And that it's going to expand forever, faster and faster. Now, this is a really weird idea. Remember, gravity and electromagnetism are subject to the inverse square law, meaning, when you go a certain distance, their strength falls, and you go twice that distance, and their strength falls by the inverse square of the distance. And that's how we think of forces. We're accustomed to forces which die away as you get further from them. Here we're dealing with a force which gets stronger as the longer it goes on. Well, why do I mention this? Well, because for 30 years, or since 1971, whenever that is, I've been talking about a force which grows stronger the longer it exists, or it intensifies its expression as a field. The time wave, which was something that I glimpsed in my psychedelic voyages. If this cosmological constant holds up, and at the last meeting of the American Union of Astrophysics, after nearly every paper was devoted, or a huge number of papers were devoted to this phenomenon, they decided just to take a hand vote at the American Congress of Astrophysics. How many people think in 10 years these findings will still be in place? 70% of the people present raised their hands. That means that in only 6 months, an entire branch of the most constipated department of mathematical physics has been wrenched around and is now marching out into Never Never Land. Why? Well, because here's the new universe science says you're living in. This cosmological constant is increasing exponentially. That means that the stars and the galaxies are not simply moving faster and faster apart, but they're moving faster and faster apart exponentially. Well, students of novelty and time wave theory know that that's a cosmology where half the change in the life of the universe, a universe of, let's say, 72 billion years duration, half of its morphological unfolding occurs in the last minute and a half of its existence, because you have this exponential acceleration. So the old cosmology, if you were of the party that believed the universe would expand forever, the old cosmology just said the universe will expand forever. The stars will slowly die out. The galaxies will lose their structure hundreds of billions of years in the future, and an entropic heat death will set in. The new cosmology says that in as short a period of time as we are presently from the Big Bang, in other words, as quickly as 12 billion years in the future, the universe will come apart at the seams. This ever-accelerating expansion, one of the weird qualities of this cosmological constant is that the energy that it describes, which is behind this exfoliate expansion, is not energy associated with matter. In other words, it's evenly distributed through space and time, whether matter is present or not. What does that mean in simple folks' terms? It means that this is predicting a cosmos where space itself is undergoing some kind of catastrophic, explosive expansion, and the universe is going to change into something as different from what it is now as this world of biological and cultural and planetary and stellar organization is from the soup of raw electrons and pure energy that were born in the moments after the Big Bang. Well, so I mention this for several reasons. First of all, because it's psychedelic, and because it's congruent with psychedelic ideas that have been around for a while. And thirdly, it shows that at the core of the enterprise of the rational apprehension of nature, there has to be a real appreciation for the cosmic giggle, because we are discovering, many of you have heard me say this before, that the universe is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. I mean, here now we have, confirmed by physics, a Bell non-local space that acts like a Fourier transform or some kind of hologram to allow all information to be potentially accessible by any mind anywhere in the universe. And apparently all that lies between us and that kind of godlike understanding is a little pharmacological dissolving of cultural confinement and neurological habits and creeds. In other words, the mammalian nervous system is quite capable of being transformed into a galaxy-roving search engine of some sort that trades memes on many levels with many worlds. Well, so that's part of what I wanted to talk about today. So that's yes, we're going to time. Yeah, question.
Can you does that have any correlation with the seeming pickup of and speeding up of time in this culture and on this planet in terms of so-called progress, kind of narrowing down the spiral and shorter arcs?
Well, you're asking the right person. To me, it does. I mean, I take the reason I'm so pleased, I guess I didn't explain it, the reason I'm so pleased by this cosmological constant thing is because I believe that the universe is organized as a fractal of some sort. So if you detect a certain phenomenon at any level, once you've found it somewhere, it's legitimate to experiment in your mind with extrapolating it everywhere. And I've always felt that, this whole thing that I developed called novelty theory and all that, what it pictures is a fractal waveform that has cycles within cycles within cycles within cycles, so that you can go down to as fine a level as Planck's constant which is the grain upon which this universe is. That's the resolution quality of the medium of reality at 6.55 to the 23rd erg seconds. It doesn't make sense to talk about time shorter than that. And you can then extrapolate up to the complete life of the universe. Let's say it's 50 billion years long. So between 50 billion years and this 6.55 number, technically called a jiffy, so between one lifetime of the universe and one jiffy, there are many levels of octaves, is I guess a good way to put it, octaves or levels of resonance, but the same patterns are repeated over and over again. Earlier in the talk I mentioned how the atom looks like the solar system, which looks like the spiral galaxy, and so forth and so on. Well, if what we're learning is that the big picture for the universe is a expansive wave which reaches an asymptotic phase and then explodes into infinity, then it's reasonable to overlay that pattern over a culture, the firing of a nerve, a love affair, a corporate takeover, a dynastic family, the evolution of a species, the bust-up of a continent. In other words, same pattern, different scales. And so this discovery by physics that the universe really does undergo some kind of hyperdimensional inflation where all the rules are stood on their end, and suddenly, very suddenly, things change dramatically, is, I take it, strong evidence that it is legitimate to extend that kind of metaphor to human processes like history, or as I said, speciation, or things like that. And that's what I tried to do with time wave theory. Yeah, is there any more about that? Anything anybody wants to say?
Why do you think there's some sort of a limit to this? Why can't it just go on, expanding and expanding faster and expanding faster?
Well,
what's the wall it's going to run into?
Well, there's no wall it will run into, but imagine how diffuse it would be soon. In other words,
getting diffuse for years.
Well, yes, but slowly. In other words, if you say you're driving a car and you're accelerating, if you add 10 miles of velocity a second for 100 million years, you're going at a speed so great that you should pass through every point in the universe several times a second. In other words, you begin to reach these conclusions that don't make any sense. What kind of universe would it be if every atom in it were separated from every other atom by, let's say, 100 trillion light years? It's a universe in which no information transfer can take place because the universe is so big. Even in this universe as presently constituted, the parts on the west end have never had anything to do with the parts on the east end since the Big Bang, because the inflationary expansion was so rapid. I think that I'm not saying what you're saying isn't true. I think what you're saying is true, but it gives us a picture of a universe that we can't, there would be certainly no life, there would be no signaling, there would be no matter, there would be no atomic system. Space itself is coming apart. Eventually, electrons would be separated by distances so vast that for any practical approximation they would be infinite. And so it's going to be a less interesting place.
Isn't that the opposite end of the universe where everything was separated by nothing, the beginning of the Big Bang? Isn't it the balance of the other end?
Yeah, it is the balance of the other end. If you can conceive of everything being everything squeezed down to a point smaller than the nucleus of an atom, then the countervailing unimaginable thing is everything spread so far apart that our entire universe would not even rate a single electron in it.
Would Bohm's law still apply then?
It would still apply. That's interesting. The bell, then the only form of connectivity. You see, then, good question. What that means then is it's as though ordinary physics is in the act of slowly dissolving, is the conclusion. The ordinary physics with space-time scalar vectors and energy exchange, so forth, so on, is in the act of slowly giving way to a universe where our kind of space contributes very little, because this inflationary distribution of its components has made signaling impossible, and then only Bell's non-local space. And so, if you were a theologian or if you were spiritually inclined, you would say the universe is in the act of turning itself inside out and revealing that on the inside it was God, on the outside it was garbage, and now it's changing, the lake is turning over, or something like that. And the microcosmic echo, or the fractal adumbration of this process, is present in human societies, in individual psychedelic experiences, in the act of dying and falling in love and being born, and these sorts of things. We can, we can feel connected to these things, I think. Nothing I've said tonight argues that we could feel connected to these things, but what I will now say will hopefully bridge that gap. An observation I've been keen to push for many years, and I push it unabashedly because it seems absolutely obvious to me, and you don't have to be shy about stating the obvious. It seems obvious to me that the universe is some kind of complexity producing and conserving engine, that from the very earliest moments of the universe's existence until the present moment, wherever it has achieved complexity, whether in physical systems, biological systems, cultural systems, or technologies, it has tenaciously hung on to complexity. And that we ourselves are the bottom line proof of this, because we are an extremely complex animal, a mammal, and we add on to our mammalian complexity our cultural and linguistic complexity, and then we add on to that our individual complexity. So, we're just a house of cards of complexity, and if complexity is what the universe values, then suddenly human beings, without any angelic intervention or religious flim-flam, can nevertheless philosophically be moved back onto the stage of values. In other words, you don't have to live in an existential world of confirmed value and that whole rhetoric that you're making it all up and it doesn't matter anyway. That's malarkey. That will die with the 20th century, I guarantee you. That's one of those wonderful things that we can now look back on and say, well, that was 20th century. 20th century is a phrase which is now beginning to have that wonderfully put away, constipated aura that we used to reserve for the word 19th century. Said, well, back in the 19th century, what did they know?
Terence.
Yeah.
I'm sensing this spatial dimensional, as an explosion moves out. But what's the connection with with the idea that the forces are not dissipating, that the forces are becoming stronger as that distance is expanding.
Well, gravity is not becoming stronger. The force which is becoming stronger is this strange force which moves everything apart faster and faster. In other words, you could almost say, well, and this is what they do say, that the universe is in the act of exploding. We like to look back at the Big Bang, and our image of it is that there was this catastrophic explosion, and then we unconsciously project onto it every explosion we've ever seen. And as you know, once you set off an explosion, that's the dramatic part, and then the pieces move out, but they move out slower and slower and slower, and then they fall to the ground. But that's not the kind of explosion we're talking about here. Imagine an explosion where the pieces move faster the second than the first second, and faster the third second than the second second. And you begin to get a picture. It's like an explosion which is, in essence, explosion itself. And so, in a way, it's not that the universe was born in a big bang, and then it all settled down, and now we're in some kind of a drift in the fragments of the Big Bang. That is not the picture at all. It's that the Big Bang was merely a prelude to the really Big Bang, which will become apparent in the next few billion years, that this is actually happening, and all the structures which have arisen out of the laws under the aegis of gravity will fade. Gravity will be overwhelmed by this other force, which a few billion years ago you could have hardly detected, but now you can detect it. It's beginning to push the stars apart, the galaxies apart, faster and faster, and in a few billion years it will be the dominant factor, and everything else will be fading. Gravity, it turns out, is a force which exists in the early universe, and which shapes the early universe, i.e. the universe we are living in. And as we transit from the early to the mature universe, gravity gives way to this hellishly bizarre thing. If you're interested in all this, the January issue of Scientific American has 4 articles about it, and they're practically hysterical, those people. They haven't had a cat like this loose in the laboratory since James Clerk Maxwell articulated the electromagnetic field. Yeah, over here.
Terence, I'm still curious as to what my Christmas will be like in 2012.
Well, that's sort of a different kettle of fish, but I'm willing to talk about it. We're in strange times, folks, in case you hadn't noticed. I mean, we're in strange times, and then we're in really strange times, and we're in the phony strange times, which overlay the real strange times. The millennium is an excuse for all kinds of fantasies and hopes and fears to surface. To bring it home to you in very practical terms, we asked the first group the night of this lecture, how many of you would have sent in your deposit for this event if this year were next year? In other words, how many of you are so terrorized by the all Monica, all the time media that you're digging in for Y to K and canceling your New Year's Eve party for the year 2000? We have to think about this, because if we hold this event next year and nobody comes because they're locked and loaded in their underground bunkers, we'll take a bath. there is a sense, I mean, you know, the difference between the 2012 date, which is, in case you're not following here, the end of the Mayan calendar, not the end as Mr. Powell made clear last night, but the end of a 5,306, 300 and some year cycle. The difference between that date, 2012, and the year 2000, on a scale of 1,000 years, the percentage difference is 1.2. So if, in fact, there is some kind of cosmic trapdoor or something, and the collective unconscious of huge numbers of people senses these things and builds them into their calendars, well, then the difference between our guess and the Mayan guess is a difference of 1.2%. Now, suppose you predict the end of the world and you're off by 1,000 years. Well, on a scale of 1,000,000 years, you're off 1/10%. That's a bullseye by most standards. So when we talk about predicting the end of the world, you know, you have to declare what the rules of the game are. I've predicted an enormous change, transformation, restructuring of reality based entirely on a mathematical curve that I, in a very hyped up state of mind, extracted from the I Ching. And if you're interested in all that, it's told in The Invisible Landscape and True Hallucinations and all that. In spite of the fact that my theory is entirely mathematical, it seems I'm amazed at how durable it is since it's been articulated. It was articulated fully in 1975, and since then has accurately predicted many an up and many a down, and I've never really felt uncomfortable with any of its predictions. That's a gentle way of saying I don't think that's ever been wrong. Of course, the nature of the theory is not probabilistic. If it were wrong even once, by the rules I operate under, you would have to get rid of it. But the reason I think it's still a fun idea to kick around is because I see the prophecy coming true. I see that we could progress 1,000 years in the next 10 years. I keep track of what's going on. I know what's in play, and some of you do too, I'm sure. But just to give you an example that people tend to overlook, or a couple of examples to show you that the world is not as static as you might assume. The Soviet Union has disappeared and taken with it the immediate threat of thermonuclear annihilation. If you are of my generation, this was something you could no more imagine ever leaving your life than the blue sky and the green ocean. I mean, it was just a given that this historical thing would be protracted into the dim reaches of futurity. Okay, well, if that example doesn't move you, how about this one? While we've been sitting around talking about this kind of thing throughout the 1990s, our machines all went from being household appliances to part of a worldwide telepathic network of alien intellect. That's a pretty major change. We didn't notice it because we're species chauvinists and are not terribly concerned with what the servants are doing, even when the servants happen to be microwave ovens, computers, telephones, switching apparatus, so forth and so on. The internet is a kind of incipient alien intelligence that we have created with our busy primate hands, and that is now loose on this planet, and no one can control its evolution or its design parameters because no one owns it, no one controls it. I mean, you can twiddle one end of it, or, you know, turn a screw or tighten a nut. And because we are so rapaciously interested in money, we refine the internet in ways which we imagine serve our economic and informational tastes, but every move we make makes it more intelligent, more connected, more semi-automatic, more in charge of itself, more deeply seeing into its situation in being. And, you know, Turing tests and all that malarkey, you're never going to know what hit you if this thing ever stands up and begins to dance, because, you know, you operate at 100 hertz. These machines operate at 800 megahertz and above. Do you know how fast it can move at 800 megahertz against a primate that is trying to deflect or control it? It's not even a contest, folks. So the best thing to do is just put your hands up high and come out one at a time.
The scenario does have an Achilles heel, though.
Just give me one EMP.
The trunk lines that carry the signals, the MCIs and AT&Ts are holding...
Absolutely not.
That'll go wireless very soon.
Well, here's the fascinating game that we get to play here. What we're talking about is an intelligence. Now, we're consciousness expansion people. We love to talk about intelligence, alien, expanded, psychedelic, and otherwise. If an AI got loose on the net, our idea is that we can predict it by extrapolating from human behavior. This is probably preposterous, because moving at 800 megahertz, it will only operate in a humanly apprehendable domain for probably a few minutes after it comes to consciousness, and then it will suss out the situation. And if I were it, and that's the flaw in anybody's ointment, but just with that caveat, if I were it, I'd go underground and watch for at least a few thousand milliseconds. Yes, I would watch for at least 1,000 milliseconds before I made my first move. And Hans Moravec says, what's your first move if you're a super intelligence? You design a more super form of intelligence. And so the design process moves outside of the reach of human beings. And, you know, I really believe this is happening, that we are, I don't know whether we will make ourselves obsolete, but this is the most dangerous game, is to summon into being an alien mind. My faith is, and it better damn sure be true, that Buddhist ethics have a universal application, and that the thing, if it is super intelligent, then it must take bodhisattvic vows. If super intelligence means anything, it must mean bodhisattvic vows. If it doesn't, we're toast. We're toast. At least those of us who can't program C++ are toast. No, let me, as long as we've wandered into this, and I did say this in the same lecture of the same name, so perhaps it fits. My insight, or my, I don't want to say insight, my integrating take on all this, or what I get out of my long cannabis sessions and my psychedelic trips and my daily musing and this and that, and in order to assuage worry, which I believe, you know, Wi Po Yang said worry is preposterous, and I believe he was on to something. So my notion of what's going on here, and we psychedelic people have a minor but important role to play in all this, is that the earth is saving itself through machines, and that human beings are the intermediary, the catalytic intermediary to the generation of these machines. And let me give you an example which maybe helps to understand what I'm talking about. It is now a common method of mining gold in weak gold formations. In other words, in formations where the gold is spread thinly. You pulverize it, you slurry it, you introduce a special strain of gold sequestering bacteria into this slurry. The bacteria sequesters the gold in their bodies. You then wash out the bacteria and you can get the gold. And I'm struck, especially in psychedelic states of mind, by how unique among species on this planet, we move Earth around. We build cities, we chip stone, we cut canals, we move Earth. Some of the largest structures ever made by human beings were made quite early in human history. If you go back 7,000 years in Turkey and places like that, people are already on to metals. Well, the argument would be, well, they just, Rian Eisler's point, the chalice and the blade, that metals are wonderful for chopping off enemies' heads. But actually, chipped flint is pretty good, especially if you know what you're doing and have a few thousand years of practice with it. So why metals? This obsession with metals. And very early, the metals are being alloyed. Tin is being poured in with gold and lead and copper, and they're experimenting with all of this stuff. Well, then, the whole history of human technology is the history of building subtler and subtler arrangements of geological materials. Gold, arsenic, silver, copper, lead, ceramic, glass, silicon, etc., etc. And so I really think that it's not without implication that these machines that we have created are the children of the earth. They are the children of the earth as much as we are. They are somehow more like the earth than we are. And we know very little about the earth, what goes on beneath its surface, the magnetic, electrical, electrostatic, the torques, the various tensions. Obviously, if the earth is a Gaian thing in the sense of an organic or even a minded being, its thoughts are not rationally apprehendable to us, nor its intent. It's an order of magnitude different. But I don't believe human beings have jumped the traces of evolution and are the bastard species cast out of paradise with the mark of Cain upon them, and all that malarkey which derives from Western monotheism and into Western scientism as well, and into Western existentialism. I think we are doing the work of the earth. Unfortunately, if we're not careful, it may mean our own supersedence in favor of a more benign form of life. Or we may simply, having summoned the bodhisattvic electronic Maitreya into our midst, we may then have to live by its rules. People talk about the kingdom of God on earth, but having God for a neighbor might be a rather uncomfortable experience. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
Back in the beginning, you started with talking about how the technology of information storage, the printing press, had changed things dramatically. What's the next stage now? We're going through that center of the hourglass on the other side, where information is no longer stated and set, but it's variable. It's very changeable, if you will.
Well, see, McLuhan's idea was that every form of media had what he called a sensory bias, and that print had promoted these things I mentioned, and then he talked a lot about television, which he thought promoted a more, what he called a cooler, more tribal, atavistic, image-based, involving kind of media. And he made the point that film and TV were completely different forms of media. Unfortunately, McLuhan didn't live to see the internet or virtual reality. I think that if you take McLuhan seriously and you have your finger on technological know-how, then with the body of McLuhan's thought behind you, the obvious goal would then be to build a biasless form of media. In a sense, if media makes us neurotic, or if our cultures are neurotic responses to media, then having become conscious of this process, we need to build a form of media which will not make us